The final UCP leadership debate took place in Edmonton on Tuesday night. The 7 candidates covered a wide range of topics from energy to policing to healthcare and education. To talk about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us from Edmonton. Tyler, apparently the debate did not go so well for Danielle Smith due to the format, but it did go fairly well for Travis Toews and Rebecca Schultz.
Yeah, the debate overall was a pretty interesting sort of setup. And the important thing is that candidates were sort of assigned a topic and they were given an amount of time to talk about the topic, and then they got to pick who they were going to debate. So say it was, energy, and they would get to pick Travis Toews or Danielle Smith or whatever. But the interesting thing on Tuesday was that only one person, I think Rajan Sawhney, picked Danielle Smith as their sort of debate partner. And then all the candidates had these little placards that they could hold up and they could intervene and get their say in. But the sort of net effect of it, I think, was that Danielle Smith, the front runner in the race, did not actually get all that much time to talk, perhaps in comparison to some of the others. Certainly that's what it felt like. And when she was asked about whatever, she would then try and pivot that back to her sort of core point, which is the Alberta Sovereignty Act proposal. So it was sort of an interesting format. It made for a relatively civil debate and a relatively thorough discussion of the issues. But it was, sort of sitting in the crowd watching, it seemed like there was a little bit of tactics at play as the other candidates picked who they wanted to discuss these various issues with. And as you mentioned, Travis Toews came off quite strongly in the debate on Tuesday, and Rebecca Schultz as well, and Rajan Sawhney too, all sort of made, I think, a bigger splash than maybe people would have expected. All that aside, this is a bit of a ramble, but all that aside, the person who got the hoots and the hollers and the wild applause was certainly Danielle Smith when she did get the chance to speak.
So now the discussion of Alberta Autonomy or the Sovereignty Act came up again last night during the debate, as you mentioned. Why would it be brought up when our economy is doing so well right now?
Well, it's sort of an interesting question, and I've been wondering about that for a couple weeks because I talked to Preston Manning a couple years ago and said, what is it that sparks this sort of thing? Why do we have these flare-ups of alienation? And he said, it's economic, it's economic, it's economic. And obviously it's not particularly economic at the moment because things are going well, even if this recovery is maybe not as sort of broad as some of the ones we've seen in the past. But the people I talked to and what I've heard in the debate and all that stuff is that really there's sort of two things happening. The first is sort of this hangover from the Trudeau Liberals and the policies from sort of like 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19 that sort of led to this last flare-up, Bill C-69, Bill C-48, carbon tax, these sort of issues are still lingering. And then the other thing is the COVID-19 pandemic and sort of simmering resentment, I guess, over those decisions. Even if they were largely provincial decisions made, there's a lot of frustration, I guess you could say, about that among the UCP base. And of course, the other thing is that, sort of since time immemorial, 120 years, politicians in Alberta have had pretty good success running against Ottawa. So, you sort of take all those factors together and it sort of makes sense that we are seeing this now, even if it's relatively good economic times. And of course, it's been ratcheted up even from what Jason Kenney was talking about just a few years ago when he was running to be leader and running to be premier of the province.
There was a split between the candidates when it came to supporting a provincial police force, Tyler. Smith and Toews were both in favor. In your opinion, who was against the idea?
Well, Rebecca Schultz and Rajan Sawhney were probably the most outspoken against it, and Brian Jean is sort of straddling the fence, I would say. He basically was like, look, I don't think we can do anything that's going to reduce the number of police officers, and perhaps we can let municipalities make their own choices. Perhaps, some town wants their own police force, another town wants the RCMP, so he's, maybe proposing a bit of a hybrid model. But there was a really interesting exchange between Danielle Smith and Rajan Sawhney about this. And she said, look, the Rural Municipalities Association and other municipalities said, look, we like the RCMP. We don't want an Alberta Provincial Police Force. How can you support this proposal, go ahead with this proposal when that's the case? And Smith said, well, look, no, you're not, why are you not respecting the wishes of the UCP membership that have said that they sort of endorse this idea? So really interesting to see that dynamic play out. And the reason that's interesting, not just because the issue itself is interesting, but also because the UCP membership skews so heavily towards rural and small town Alberta, which is exactly the places that would be affected by any switch to a provincial police force. In fact, the pitch for a provincial police force is to help those areas, increase or improve response times, get more officers, that sort of thing. So really interesting split between the candidates on Tuesday, I would say.
Now, the recent fiscal update, Tyler, from the UCP shows we have roughly a $13 billion surplus. What will the province do with the extra money? Will it maybe go towards our provincial debt, added to the Heritage Trust Fund? What are you hearing?
A little bit of everything seems to be the answer to that. It doesn't sound like we're going to get any, Ralph Bucks 2.0 or Mo money, as people over in Saskatchewan are getting. But it does seem like there's going to be money put into the Heritage Trust Fund. Does seem like there's going to be some money put to paying down the debt. So, normal conservative proposals, I would say, on that front. I think we'll probably see some spending, especially with an election coming up next year when we get to budget season in early 2023. So that's sort of the state of affairs, but it's a remarkable turnaround, $13 billion surplus. I think when the last budget came out, the prediction was like a $500 million surplus or something like that. So just like a colossal increase in the amount of money at the Alberta government's disposal. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Of course, it'll depend a little bit who becomes the next leader and what their ideas are going to be about what to do with that money.
Premier Kenney announced the province would be re-indexing income tax. So Tyler, how does this work and how will it really benefit Albertans?
Sure. So there's obviously a handful of income tax brackets in Alberta. That first one is sort of up to $29,000 that you get tax-free. And so in the past, those brackets moved up every year. So let's say the first bracket was at $29,000. Maybe next year it would be at $30,000, $30,500, something like that. So what the government did is it de-indexed it. So those brackets did not bump up with inflation. However, people's salaries and wages do continue to bump up in that same period of time. So the net effect of that is that people are paying more tax into the federal or into the provincial government. And when they made this change, it was sort of explained as, look, we need money. We are not going to introduce a PST. We need to raise revenues in other ways so that we don't have to cut services. This became a major sort of flare up for the UCP, a major talking point for the New Democrats. And they'd sort of promised to re-index it when things were looking better. So that is now what's happened. It's going to be retroactive through 2022. So people's taxes this year and moving forward will be slightly lower than they were in years past. I think the prediction is that it'll amount to about $300 in savings per Albertan and about a $300 million hit to the Treasury. But of course, with $13 billion sitting around, $300 million is pennies.
Yeah, I mean, that's really supports the Alberta advantage and maybe will fall in nicely with Kenney's spiel of getting more people from Toronto and Vancouver to move to Alberta, because we have such a labor shortage here in so many different industries. Rachel Notley in the NDP said now that the province is awash with cash, fee hikes should be reversed, Tyler. But let me ask you, will that happen?
Oh, that's a good one. It didn't come up in the debate actually, and maybe it's a niche issue, but certainly like the parks fees, for example, did make quite a splash when the UCP introduced them. So, it's possible. I wouldn't say it's likely, but certainly the point of it is sort of that the New Democrats now have a great attack on the United Conservatives. For the last few years, they've been able to say, we can't spend on this, we need to cut this, we need to de-index this, because we're in a bit of a fiscal crunch. That's no longer really the case. Of course, there's tons of debt that could be paid down, but the New Democrats basically saying, look, we have all this money, why are we not doing more to help people? Why are we not getting rid of these fees? Why are we not increasing benefits to families? All that kind of stuff. So again, as we look ahead to the next year, this is sort of setting the stage a little bit for some of the debates and some of the attack lines, I guess, that we're going to hear going into the election, I think.
Our Premier, Jason Kenney, has been in South Korea this past week, getting his last few air miles in while he can, I guess. Now, Kenney went to Asia on a trade mission to discuss what? Small modular reactors?
Yeah. So, our premier for 6 more weeks, give or take, and making the most of it. So, the reason I think this is interesting is just because, he's still kind of out burning the shoe leather, still showing up to work every day. And he was only there for like 3 or 4 days, I think, which is, I've flown over to that part of the world, and I can't imagine the jet lag of flying to South Korea, being there for a couple of days and then getting on a plane and coming home. But yeah, there was an agreement, sort of a memorandum of understanding signed a couple of years ago between South Korea and Alberta on working on small modular reactors. So that's what they've been discussing. I don't believe there have been any sort of massive developments out of that trade mission just yet. But notable that the premier is still showing up for work. Gave his 3 months notice and is still out there, I guess.
It's funny you talk about the jet lag. You're right. I've been to Europe, and going out to Asia, why not just do a Zoom call?
Well, honestly.
Save taxpayers and save the jet lag. Now, Tyler, Premier Kenney also announced that Calgary will be getting a new statue of Winston Churchill. Tell me more.
It will be at the McDougall Centre, which is, downtown building in Calgary that is also sort of the Calgary headquarters of the government, I guess you can say. Lots of press conferences happen there and things like that. Edmonton does have a statue of Winston Churchill at Churchill Square downtown. And so this announcement was made last week, I think, that there's a society in Calgary, the Sir Winston Churchill Society, I believe. And they've sort of partnered up with the provincial government to create a statue of Churchill, who I believe Kenney is quite an admirer of Churchill, and certainly had many nice things to say when he announced this statue. So that will eventually happen, be honestly a new statue for people to throw paint at and tear down when they get riled up.
A little controversial. Now let's circle back to the UCP leadership for just a moment here. What are the latest polls showing? Is it really a two-horse race between Daniel Smith and Travis Toews?
Well, this is actually one of the really confusing things because there hasn't been very much polling. There was a little bit of polling in late July, right after the sort of final candidate list was selected, and then again in early August. And I have not seen any updated polling. The campaigns have not really leaked anything. The big polling firms have not done very much. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The big one being that it's really hard to do. How do you get a sample size of just UCP members? Some of the other polling has said, we'll poll people who identify as UCP supporters, and that's sort of how they're getting their information. But it does seem like it's a 2, perhaps 3-horse race. Danielle Smith certainly getting the bulk of the media attention, and the other candidates having very much to respond to what she's been saying. Travis Toews, I think, is probably our second place horse in this race at the moment. But of course, the UCP has a preferential ballot system, right? So you pick a first, second, third choice or whatever. People drop off the bottom and votes are added. There's a math involved, but it basically puts someone like, for example, Brian Jean, who are his supporters going to back at the end of the day if there isn't a clear win for someone on the first ballot. So that's sort of the state of affairs. And then the other factor, and sorry to be going on about it, but the other factor here is that there's the whole ground game side of this, right? It's which candidate's team is making the most calls to supporters, who signed up the most members until the deadline in early August, who is doing the best get out the vote thing, helping people fill out their ballots, get them mailed in, all that sort of stuff. So there's a handful of other factors going on here. And you can imagine a scenario in which, for example, Danielle Smith gets all this massive attention, but someone like, say, Travis Toews has this incredible ground game and actually comes out ahead. So the votes are out there for anyone who wants them. They're locked in at 123,000 members, but I think there's still votes to be fought over for sure.
So how much has Rona Ambrose, former Harper cabinet minister, really helped Rebecca Schultz in her campaign?
Well, again, it's hard to say because of the lack of polling. However, talking to a couple sort of party people, they've been impressed and pleased with the splash that Rebecca Schultz has made. She does have that high-profile endorsement. She has got some media attention. She is visiting and knocking on doors and doing, sort of all the stuff that needs to be done. The thing that someone said to me the other day about Rebecca Schultz is that she's sort of the face of the future of this party, and so the impact that she's made is going to be important for the party sort of down the road, whether she wins or does not win this race. Just someone like her being competitive in this race is good for the party. So in some ways, I think her impact remains to be seen in some ways over the sort of medium term.
And Tyler, the UCP will be choosing their new leader on October the 6th.
That's right. It'll be announced down in Calgary, be a bit of a party, I expect. And then just a couple weeks, I think about 3 weeks after that, they're going to have their annual general meeting up in Edmonton. So there should be a busy October for the United Conservatives as they crown a new leader and look ahead to what's next.
Legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.